Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you happen to be. And a very special warm welcome in particular to any viewers who may be tuning in from Southeast Asia itself, as Gita Wirjawan, one of our panelists, is. He's in Indonesia this morning. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie, and I'm delighted to be joined by two of the most experienced trade negotiators I know, and also two of the best people I know, both of whom are non-resident scholars in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment. Barbara Weisel, a former assistant U.S. trade representative, experienced negotiator, among other things, the former U.S. chief negotiator of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, from which the United States withdrew during President Trump's first term in 2017. If some of you can remember back in the Jurassic era, when the United States used to do plurilateral trade negotiations and pacts, Barbara was a central player in that. And then Gita Wirjawan, Indonesia's former trade minister, also chairman of Indonesia's investment board, and a longtime player in the World Trade Organization negotiations and other settings as well. We're in the middle of a kind of global trade war, but also of global trade conflict. And Southeast Asia has not been able to escape from that. I want to put a couple of propositions on the table in the first instance. First, I think in Southeast Asia, and team, you tell me if you disagree with this, but I think like other countries around the world, the mathematical operations that matter to them are addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. The agenda that matters to them is essentially their own. It's growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, technology and knowledge transfer, and ultimately transformation and development in their economies. And so if you extrapolate from that set of mathematical operations, addition and multiplication, to their external trade and FDI relationships, what they want seems to be relationships and connections that are enhancing of those agendas. And from that perspective, externally imposed tariffs, market closures, unwillingness to provide market access, export restrictions, and controls of other kinds that use regulatory administrative instruments don't do that, which suggests that trade conflict with external powers in some ways, particularly when restrictions are imposed unilaterally, is from the get-go not really consistent with the way they see their interests. That brings me to the second point, which is obviously the United States and China are in the background of this, and each in their way, the US and China in their strategic competition are both courting this region, but also have restrictions on some elements of business and commerce with this region. So let's not pretend this is just about Donald J. Trump or it's just about the United States. But I think for most countries in Southeast Asia, as in other regions, they want more touch points with more external partners on the compass in order to be enhancing of those agendas around growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, technology, and knowledge transfer. And so from their perspective, they don't want a zero-sum set of relationships with external players, and that's inclusive of the United States and China. So when, for example, the United States comes around and says, don't take Chinese money, don't take Chinese technology, don't do this, don't do that, or as Mr. Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, told a Senate committee about a week and a half ago, the United States is still prepared to come after an economy like Vietnam because it's looking not just at what happens bilaterally between the US and Vietnam in the commercial space, but between Vietnam and China in the second instance, that can create tensions and contradictions as well. Third, in the all of this, part of the American story, and I say this because I'm American, Barbara, you're American too, is essentially to make a strategic argument to the region. The United States spends a lot of time talking about security and about China in the background, essentially because you all fear China, or in some cases have direct territorial conflicts with China or nationalisms that are clashing with China's. You should inevitably want to seek a good relationship with the United States. Don't worry about all this trade and commercial stuff. I think that's becoming, frankly, if I may be blunt about it, a very hard argument to sustain. both in Southeast Asia and in other parts of the world. For a lot of countries, security and economics are not always quite divisible in that way. And to just say, forget all this commercial stuff, let's put that in a box and let's talk about how we can collaborate on China, that's becoming hard. And so the danger for the United States, and particularly strategically, team, if I may postulate, is that commercial stuff is going to start to bleed into the broader sets of relationships the United States has. And at a time when the United States has opted out of a lot of these pact-based rule-setting processes. It's on the outside of RCEP, CPTPP, DIPA, all of these things. So in that context, we thought we would talk a little bit with the team here about where things are, how it looks from a Southeast Asian perspective, where with some of the reciprocal tariffs on pause until July 8th, Barbara and Gita think this is going to end up, and then what some of the macroeconomic impacts are. And so maybe that's a good place to start. And Barbara, I thought I'd just start with you because you've been watching this for a long time. Just as we count down to July 8th, what's the situation right now as you see it? Where are we with what the administration is or is not prepared to do and what they're looking for? And particularly since most countries seem to just want this to kind of go away, let's just start with what your expectations are for the 3 to 4 weeks to come. Barbara, I'll start with you, and then maybe Gita can flip it.
Great. Good morning and good evening, everyone. I want to start by saying that, the countries in ASEAN understood from the beginning that they didn't have the leverage that, for instance, China had to push back on the United States. So they kind of unilaterally disarmed at the ASEAN summit. They announced, we're not going to retaliate. None of the ASEAN countries were going to retaliate. So they had to negotiate. And I guess, they're all in various stages of the process. Some have been here multiple times. Some are negotiating mostly virtually. But they have put together packages as the U.S. has demanded, put them on the table for the U.S. to review and to respond to. Those proposals that the countries have put forward include all of the things that the U.S. has demanded. That is to say, tariff cuts, purchase agreements of various products, LNG, agricultural goods, planes, military equipment, other things. And then they have spent a lot of time talking about elimination of non-tariff barriers, customs enforcement on transshipment from China, and then getting into the more economic security issues of investment screening and other, export controls, things like that. So the packages have many pieces to them, and I think that they've been going back and forth trying to refine them. In return, I think all of the ASEANs have accepted that the U.S. is not going to completely eliminate the tariffs that it's imposed. The 10% global baseline is going to remain, and they don't expect the U.S. to be flexible on that. They don't expect that the U.S. will make any tariff cuts of its own, even on products that we don't make in the U.S. and probably would make sense for us to cut. They're not expecting any of that. One of the areas I think that's still open now is what they can potentially negotiate on the 232, the national security tariffs that the U.S. has put in place on steel and aluminum, on auto parts, and then all the other investigations that are underway, many of which are on products that are important to ASEAN countries. So you have minerals, pharmaceuticals, trucks, chips, things that are going to matter to ASEAN countries, and whether or not it's possible to negotiate that, for instance, along the lines of what the UK did on a quota. So they're in the process. I expect that they will either reach deals before July 8th, or that the administration, based on what Besson said, would be willing to extend the deadline for those countries that are in the process of negotiating. I think there are questions about that. Trump left the G7 early yesterday. There was an expectation that there might be a deal with Japan on the margins of the G7 so he could come back, and that would be a success. If that is not there and there aren't other deals, there are questions about whether or not Trump will actually go ahead and reimpose the higher tariffs after July 8th rather than to continue the negotiations. And I think they're all of the ASEANs are aware of that and recognize that they need to keep the negotiations going just to be sure that, there's to lessen the probability that the Trump will reimpose the tariffs in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Before I go to Gita, in ASEAN, you have 10 countries, and you have no bandwidth in this administration, right? They're negotiating with China, they're negotiating with Japan, they're negotiating with, Trump was standing there with Keir Starmer yesterday, dropped the UK agreement on the ground. So this isn't the typical process. If we rewind the clock to when you used to do this, there was more of a process than there is now. So there's not a lot of bandwidth. And there are a lot of countries globally. Everybody wants to negotiate. They have to do it all bilaterally. And there's 10 countries in ASEAN, some of which are more or less noticeable in the Washington context. So just of the 10, who's actually seriously negotiating with the U.S. at this point?
I think
the Vietnamese have been in and out a few times.
In and out. I think that the countries that I would expect to move the fastest are Vietnam and the Philippines. Right. Indonesia and Malaysia, Cambodia are in discussions, but I don't think that it has been face to face in the last couple of weeks, and so I think those may be behind the Vietnamese and potentially the Philippines.
Right, so I asked
quite eager.
Yeah, I asked because essentially, if I was being predictive, your expectation is we hit the clock. The clock ticks down on July 8th. We hit the deadline, and all of them are going to need extensions, with the possible exception of the Vietnamese, essentially. If they even
That's the way it appears from where we sit right now. As you said, there's limited bandwidth. There's a lot of countries. There's a lot of details to go through. It is possible that the administration does something along the lines of what it did with the UK, which is, okay, we have this framework agreement. This is good enough. We'll negotiate the details later, but we'll call a ceasefire now, and we won't impose higher tariffs on any of these countries that we have a framework agreement with. These are all fine, and we'll get to the details later. So it is possible that something like that happens as well. I think the question is, for all the countries where the negotiations are really not underway at all, where there hasn't been bandwidth for any kind of discussion. There were 57 countries, even beyond ASEAN. What happens to those countries with which the U.S. has not really had any meaningful discussion?
Right. So Gita, that flips us naturally to kind of a Southeast Asian perspective on this. If you're sitting in Southeast Asia, which you are actually today, I would think this is absolutely bananas. You've spent years talking to the U.S. about market access and about the U.S. joining pacts and agreements and doing more. The U.S. wants to pivot to Asia. Suddenly the U.S. is imposing all these tariffs, and there isn't even a process to escape, to get out from under this, other than to come and wheedle and plead and try to make it go away. And then even if you try to do that, they don't have the bandwidth. And meanwhile, there's the economic impact on your economy. So, the region's enormously diverse, but you can either pick out a few countries and argue it from that perspective. But I'm just wondering how it looks from where you're sitting.
You're right. You've got one country that earns less than $2,000 worth of GDP per capita, and another $91,000 worth of GDP per capita. That explains the divergence and the tendency for anybody to try to bilateralize this. But I think the savings grace would have been that a few weeks ago there was a collective posturing to sort of concede, and it's been well articulated by Barbara. The concession, or some might have construed it as capitulation, is on the back of what Barbara had alluded to earlier, the lack of leverage. If you take a look at the marginal productivity on most countries in Southeast Asia, it's nowhere near where it's supposed to be, and much less than what China's is. And the second is, I think, our ability to take a long view. I think it's safe to assume that many people in Southeast Asia see this as highly episodic. This is not going to be a secular type of behavior on the U.S.'s side. And we take the long view with respect to how we take a view on both China and the U.S. I'm in a camp that fervently believes that China will continue to be a technological capital allocator. And this is not because of its technological supremacy. I think they're likely to be a 1 to the next digit as opposed to the US as being a 0 to 1, technologically speaking, but the US just can't procure technology at the kind of rate, that China has been able to, and at the rate that you've got many countries or economies in Southeast Asia earning very little income. They can't afford the expensive technologies coming from the US. However, we see the US and the West as an inevitable economic capital allocator. So I think geopolitically, Southeast Asia has got to be very deft about this, navigating through this China and the US decoupling or de-risking. China has not proven itself to be a massive economic capital allocator. And this is empirically, manifested in the very little realization of the Belt and Road Initiative since 12 years ago, when it was announced for Southeast Asia at about $800 billion. The cumulative realization is still less than $80 billion, whereas the US is sitting with massive amounts of liquidity that's not being allocated to this part of the world. So the challenge going forward for Southeast Asia is really to increase the wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks. Capital likes risks. Capital doesn't like uncertainties. Unfortunately, most countries in Southeast Asia that are filled with uncertainties don't have the translational wherewithal to translate those into a set of risks that are quantifiable, measurable, and priceable. To the extent we can do that in the long run, I think it'll be a great combination. Now, in terms of the short-term impact on whatever comes out on July 8th, I think it's already priced in. Economically, it's going to be a dent on both sides. It represents between 8 to 12% of our total exports to the US. From an ASEAN standpoint, Southeast Asia represents probably less than that, of total US's exports. But I think that would allow for us to basically recalibrate, keeping in mind that the total trade with China is already nearing $1 trillion. That train has left the station, whereas our total trade with the US is only about $530, $550 billion. That's going to move at a much more decelerated pace. So will that sustain for a long time? I'm not sure, depending on how things go in the next year or two from a policy standpoint.
Can I ask you, can I just pull that thread a little bit, particularly on what it means for Southeast Asians as they look at each other? In some regions of the world, what the US is doing is that it's actually enhancing cohesion.
Yeah,
buffeted by the US, they're coming together, they're trying to figure out ways to coordinate. Europe and Canada is one example. So much of the interaction that we have in Southeast Asia, we hear about cohesion. It's all about cohesion. There's the ASEAN way. We work together, we coordinate, we deal collectively. But actually, in this instance, the United States, because it's dealing with each bilaterally, and in a bilateral negotiation, it's actually working with the region in a way that's actually contrary to the preferred patterns for the region, but also potentially reduces the individual leverage of each country vis-a-vis the United States. What's ironic, actually, is after, a decade and a half of the US criticizing China in the region for basically dividing and conquering and refusing to deal with ASEAN collectively, we now have the United States essentially China-fying its policy and dealing with all these countries bilaterally. So there's 10 in ASEAN, but if we put, Myanmar and Laos to the side for a second and just think about the other 8, leverage individually in a negotiation with the United States, much less Malaysia's or even, the Philippines. It's very different than, it's not just a question of scale, it's a question of negotiating tactics. It's got to be hard to negotiate with the United States that way. And what's more, it's undermining of the kind of consensus and cohesion that the region usually likes to see. And frankly, that the US runs around yakking about all the time. as something that it's always supported in dealing with China. So number one, there's the inherent hypocrisy of it. But what I'm more interested in is whether you think it actually reduces regional cohesion, makes it harder, and will create a lot of side-eye among the countries vis-a-vis each other.
I don't think it's going to enhance regional cohesion.
Sure.
And the simplest way is to look at the intra-trade. The intra-trade of Southeast Asia is only about 21% of the collective GDP. It's been, stuck there for a long time. And we've been talking about, increasing that percentage to a much higher number. It's nowhere near where it is in the EU. And that, I think, speaks of, our putting a lot more focus in our communication on other things as opposed to economic integration. And there's a lot of competitiveness. But on the back of all this, there is posturing, right? I mean, January 6th this year, we signed up with BRICS, and Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand are on the wait list. Yeah, Indonesia, sorry. Indonesia participated, as a member of the BRICS. That's one way of looking out, as to help diversify away, our markets. Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia are looking the same way. So I think the tendency is not to look inward for market access purposes. The tendency is naturally, instinctively outward, looking out into China, because there's this pool of $1 trillion worth of goods and services being exchanged already. It's a much easier pool to work with as opposed to looking at the internal market of only 21% of the collective GDP.
Yeah. So
Barbara, add a point to those excellent points from Gita is that I think your point that this undermines ASEAN cohesion and the U.S. goal of supporting that in another way, and that is that right now ASEANs are trying to figure out what do they have to provide to the U.S. and what are they thinking about? They're thinking about not only are they going to be worse off vis-a-vis their regional competitors, because a lot of them are competing with one another, but are they going to be able to do things that give them competitive advantages in order to strengthen their bilateral ties with the U.S., that is to say, to enhance their position to attract the kind of investment that Gita was talking about vis-a-vis their neighbors. And so, where the U.S. was promoting China plus one strategies, and a lot of ASEAN countries were thinking about what do they do to be the country that is most attractive to companies that want to move. Now they're thinking about it in terms of, okay, how do they develop a package? How do they design a package that makes them most competitive? And that is largely vis-a-vis each other. And so I think that is another element. They're worried that others are going to get an advantage over them. And so rather than working together and thinking about this as a region, they're thinking about it very much in terms of how they can enhance their own position. And the only area that it seems that they have even begun to think about working together is on customs cooperation across the region. And I think some of that will probably happen.
Okay, so pretend I agree. Let me play stupid for a second. Help me understand. This is really directed at Barbara in the first instance. Help me understand what the administration is trying to do. Okay, so let me be blunt. The approach seems to be not strategic, not principled, and not coherent either. And maybe I'm being uncharitable, but at a strategic level, there's been one senior official who's been in Southeast Asia in this administration, and that's the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, right? He was at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore that day. The whole thing was about China, and we need to come together and forge coalition. So now we've just spent the last 5 minutes talking about how the U.S. is actually undermining regional cohesion. And unless you think you can undermine regional cohesion and competitiveness space, but somehow, like Harry Potter, wave a magic wand and get coherence in the strategic space, I don't see how the administration is moving in a strategic way toward that. Okay, then we come to principles. If the administration's, if it was principled, there'd be some governing set of principles that applied in all of this. Open market, the free and open markets, free competition regardless of the outcome, progressive opening of markets, and fairer competition policy. But it seems that we have separate bilaterals with completely contradictory objectives. A lot of this is basically just rent seeking, extractive business opportunities for this or that company. It's not grounded in a kind of consistent set of principles that are applied in each negotiation across the board. And that brings me to the third one. Is it coherent? And not particularly, because by my count, they appear to have articulated not one, not two, not three, not four, but maybe 5 different objectives of what they're trying to do, right? So one is, raise revenue, in which case you need tariffs that are high but not trade prohibitive, where there's no revenue at all. Sometimes they talk about reshoring, that's particularly Lutnick, in which case you need trade prohibitive tariffs. Sometimes they talk about countering China, in which case you wouldn't be tariffing allies and partners and you would want to forge regional cohesion. Sometimes they talk about other things as well. So at either a strategic level, a principled level, or just a tactical coherence level, explain to me what you think they're trying to do and what the theory of victory is here.
I mean, I think what they're trying to do is address our grievances. This is a grievance policy, and so we're going to use tariffs as negotiating leverage to address our grievances. The number one among those is the trade deficit. So
in goods, bilateral trade deficit.
In goods, and so I think that's the simple answer to your question. That's what they're trying to do. And yes, there are all these subsidiary objectives. We're going to protect U.S. businesses. We're going to reshore jobs. We're going to raise revenue, even if it's a negotiating tool that we're going to eventually negotiate away the tariffs. We're still going to have increased revenue because we're going to have the global 10% tariff retained. And we are going to improve national security or economic security because we're going to get all of these countries to negotiate specific commitments to screen investment where we think it's most important. And I think that sort of reflects their view that they can keep the economic security or the economic relationship in a silo from the military and security relationships. I mean, everyone understands that the military and security relationships with a number of the countries in the region have really strengthened over the last many years. And that does not seem at all to have been undermined by anything that the U.S. is doing on trade, in part because the ASEANs really want that relationship and they're going to do everything they can to ensure that it is not damaged by anything the U.S. does. So I think the U.S. feels that it has the ability to pursue these two things simultaneously.
Gita, I mean, do we have the ability to pursue these things simultaneously?
Not sure, but I was going to comment on the earlier part where if there is a strategy, it just seems to some of us in Southeast Asia that this is a better way of defining who's likely to be an enemy and who's likely to be a friend and who's likely to be a swing state. And I'm in a camp that believes that a region of $700 million people and $4 trillion worth of GDP inevitably is a swing state. And if it does require, if this new strategy requires some sort of a recalibrated fiscal space where we can have a more enhanced security relations with the U.S., so be it. I think we're cool with that because we've always looked at the U.S. more for security purposes as opposed to economic purposes. And we've been looking in the last 10 to 15 years at China more for economic relations purposes. So I think we're comfortable with that, sort of strategic direction if there's ever a strategy to this. But going forward to what Barbara was alluding to earlier, I think it hinges on the ability of each country to increase its marginal productivity, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to drive the competitiveness of each one of the 10 countries of Southeast Asia. And I think Indonesia is exposed because it only has a marginal productivity of only $25,000 per capita per year as compared to Singapore's $211,000. So it's got its work cut out. to the extent that we can move that needle up forward, I think we're going to have less vulnerability, whether the discussions are bilateralized or plurilateralized or even multilateralized.
Do you guys sense that the United States is sharpening the contradictions for Southeast Asian countries? I mean, I was really struck. Secretary Lutnick was up on the Hill the other day, and he's testifying before a Senate committee. And he gets into this interesting exchange with Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana. And the audience, you guys can Google it and watch it. And Kennedy, in kind of an old-fashioned free trade sort of way, says to Secretary Lutnick something like, if Vietnam came to you and they said, we're removing all market access barriers, we're reducing all tariff, just like open trade with the United States, would you take that? In exchange, you take your tariffs to zero on us. Would you take that deal? And Lutnick says, absolutely not. And Kennedy raises an eyebrow and says, I don't understand what we're trying to do here. And Lutnick's response to Gita's point is essentially he goes straight to China. And he says, look, there's a lot of third-party transshipment and tariff skirting behavior. So we need to get across and behind the border, and we need to talk about China, and we need to talk about restrictions. But the way Gita set that up before is that Southeast Asia is trying to get, as I said at the beginning, addition and multiplication. You want more partners in more areas and more directions on the compass as possible. U.S. for security, and you do some trade and investment stuff. U.S. a big investment partner in the region. China for a lot of that. But what I think I hear Lutnick saying is that they're going to sharpen the contradictions there and make it harder for individual Southeast Asian states to be left off the hook. And they'll say, actually, we expect you to curtail your relationship with China, put restrictions on your relationship with China. Don't do this, don't do that, or else we will take that into account as we formulate both tariff policy and other economic policies toward your this or that economy. My presumption, unless you disagree with me, is actually that's the trend line here in the US and the administration. I think that's what I hear Lutnick saying. And Lutnick, for all that people talk about how he can be a little bit loose, I think he's quite reflective, it seems, of where the boss is. And so my sense is that the US is going to make that conversation tougher. How do Southeast Asians react to that, and how do they respond to that? And then Barbara, that's for Gita. And then for Barbara, depending on that response, is it that just the U.S. kind of clubs them over the head and beats them into submission because we can? Or is there some recalibration and adjustment to, as Southeast Asians often say to us, reflect realities here as opposed to your agenda? So it's...
Yeah, Evan, Lutnick's response is pretty much in line with what I was trying to characterize.
Yeah.
In that all we got to do in Southeast Asia is not to be perceived as an enemy to the U.S., right? That's in essence, to what extent can we be perceived as being too friendly with China? I'm not sure, but I think like he said, if we agree to every point that's been asked, I don't think that's going to cut it. Because there's something else that's being wanted by the U.S. That's how we see it in Southeast Asia. So I think it's going to boil down to how we're going to reposture for security purposes. That I think is much more relevant with some of the other some of the countries more directly exposed to the South China Sea. Indonesia is less exposed as opposed to Vietnam and the Philippines. But I think that's the conversation that's being shared by many of us in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. And Barbara, is that your expectation, that the U.S. is going to sharpen the contradictions with China and make it harder for, as Gita put it, swing states in the middle?
I think they've already put their requests on the table, and those requests include efforts to squeeze China out of supply chains and to limit Chinese investment in these markets. Ultimately, will any of the ASEAN countries cross the line of suggesting that they're choosing between the US and China? I don't think so. But there are areas where I think they will agree to some of the US demands. First of all, on transshipment, and those are legitimate concerns.
Right.
But they're not concerns just for the US, they're concerns for ASEAN countries who have their own reasons for addressing that issue, revenue, law enforcement, corruption, all kinds of things that they want to get a handle on. If it's increased, then they want to deal with it. So I think those are things that they're prepared to do. Will they do additional investment screening? I think some countries will, because I think they also have legitimate concerns about the potential for Chinese investment in areas that could affect their domestic industries and employment. So will they do that? Will they create some sort of administrative process to be able to screen investment if they don't already have one? I think some countries will do that. Will they agree to certain kinds of export controls? Now I think you're getting into more difficult territory. But to the extent that ASEAN countries are concerned about the increased investment in the U.S. from China, it cuts both ways. They want the increased investment because, for the same reason everybody else wants increased investment, jobs and technology and whatever else comes with it. But if that's increased investment in areas that threaten domestic manufacturing, I think that there is some concern from ASEAN countries, and that they would be at least willing to consider some of those kinds of asks.
So let me flip the script a little bit. If instead of talking about Southeast Asians as kind of the objects of U.S. tariff policy or the objects of U.S. China competition, and we make them more the subjects, then it begs the question of what kind of levers and tools they have to actually influence outcomes with external partners. And Gita, I'm thinking of Indonesia here in an interesting way. If you rewind to 2014, when they put in place this ban on exporting basically unprocessed nickel as a way to, from Indonesia's perspective, incentivize investing in the processing in Indonesia itself to move it up the value chain. My understanding of the result of that is actually it led to some Chinese investment in processing.
Correct.
And even though it was criticized by a lot, people like us, trade types and strategic types, it may actually have been an example of how one of these countries can use some kind of lever, like an export ban, to incentivize behaviors by external partners that actually were in line with government objectives for indigenization, growth, development. And I know there are a lot of contradictions in that policy, but speak to that one. But also the more general question is about what are the levers and tools that Southeast Asians might use to flip the script on the U.S. in the first instance, or on China? Because by extension, I just wonder what it's like to negotiate with the U.S. in this. Like, what do you bring to the table other than to plead and wheedle and try to give the U.S. what it wants and make this go? What leverage do they have, and how do they?
I mean, I can claim responsibility partly for banning the exportation of finished products within that sector. I was still in the game until early part or January 2014, and that was the catalyst for relatively massive investment flows from China. And the stark difference between Chinese economic capital allocation and American capital allocation is that they're willing to deal with unknown unknowns, whereas the Americans are only willing to deal with known unknowns, right? And that's a subtle difference between uncertainties and risks. But I say this again with emphasis that I think China has capital exportation limitations. Now, on the second part, in terms of flipping the narrative, I think the onus is on many of us in Southeast Asia to try to get our act together on the marginal productivity to bring about this massive liquidity from the West. It's there, it's waiting, it's not being reallocated, and it needs to be diversified away on the back of this rising risk premium within the U.S. But it's not coming because of that lack of marginal productivity and also lack of wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks. So that's the homework for, I think, most of us in Southeast Asia, with the absolute exception of Singapore, that doesn't have any problem with attracting capital from anywhere around the world.
Mhm. And is that a global issue? I mean, are there other partners in that mix? The Europeans,
It's a
uh,
global issue.
Middle Eastern capital. I mean,
Oh yeah, I mean the
there's Gulf
European.
capital flowing into China now, for example. Is that something that Southeast Asia can tap, particularly
Yeah,
the Malaysias, the Indonesias?
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
how is that playing
But
out?
not as much as we would like. I mean, I look at the data. I don't think China is going to be able to export a lot more capital in the next 10 years because of this dual economic circulation philosophy that's been initiated about 12 years ago by the leadership. The money is in Europe, is in the G7 countries. It's not being diversified out into the global south or the emerging markets because of our inability to translate uncertainties into risks.
Do you see Japan as a prospective larger capital?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Talk about that. I don't
Well, I
just
mean,
mean like JBIC
well, I
financing,
mean,
project finance
J-
for infrastructure. I mean private capital.
yeah, Japan has been willing to take on more risk than the Americans with respect to Southeast Asia. When it comes to brick and mortar, Japan is the largest. The U.S. always brags about being, the largest investor, but most of that is actually portfolio money. When it comes to brick and mortar, it's the Japanese. In the last 40 years, the Japanese cumulatively have deployed more capital than anybody. So they know how to translate unknown unknowns to known unknowns, but they can only do it to a certain extent. But to the extent that we can move away from unknown unknowns to known unknowns, I think the Japanese are going to be able to deploy much more capital on also on top of their geopolitical interests with respect to Southeast Asia.
Right. Hey, Barbara, so you've negotiated with Southeast Asian countries when you were at USTR. When they're sitting on the other side of the table to you, what are the kind of levers, now that you're in a different role, what are the kind of levers that you see that they could pull that they're not pulling in this context, but they could be? It goes back to my point about sort of export bans, things like that. Where's the leverage for them?
I mean, I think as they understand, their leverage is fairly limited here. And I think what they want to do, and I think some countries are doing, is to present themselves as partners to the U.S. in areas where we have priorities. So, critical minerals being a good example of that, where they can try to negotiate that into an agreement that allows the U.S. to work cooperatively with these countries to develop critical minerals and promote U.S. interests in that area. And then that is a win-win outcome with the opportunity to use that to try to negotiate quotas or even potentially tariff elimination, if we could ever agree to do something as radical as that,
Right.
on imports of critical minerals. But, there aren't a lot of other areas. And they've begun and continued and accelerated negotiations with lots of other countries to show that they can diversify and they have other partners. But I don't think the U.S. really cares. It is focused, laser-like on getting these deals and continuing to twist their arms and threatening to raise tariffs. So there's not a lot that they can do about that unless they decide that they have other alternative trading partners that they can turn to that makes the trade relationship with the U.S. moot, which that's just not the case right now.
And that would essentially be who? That's China. And that's a very different China
Right.
than the one we have, because you bump up against Gita's capital export limitations, but then also the degree to which China is willing to provide market access and become
Right.
basically a demand driver for other economies.
I mean, a lot of countries are negotiating with the EU, but the EU is not a substitute for the U.S. right now either, and I don't think will be at any time in the foreseeable future. But it certainly isn't now.
So you negotiated TPP for the U.S. So can you imagine a scenario in which the U.S. negotiates plurilaterally again with Asian countries, and in what context? And what are the consequences of not doing so?
So I don't see that on the horizon anytime soon. It's sort of hard. When we decided to negotiate plurilaterally, we had been negotiating bilaterally for many years. We had a number of, 14 or 15 bilateral free trade agreements that had been negotiated since, the 1990s. And we decided consciously to move toward an Asia trade agreement because we thought, first of all, it's too slow to negotiate. It's too politically difficult to negotiate bilaterally. And that ultimately, really what we were trying to do was get common rules across the region so that it would be easier for both sides to trade and invest with each other. That we didn't want bilateral rules, the spaghetti bowl of rules and all of that. We were looking to get away from that. And I think here's where one of the areas that really concerns me about what the U.S. is doing with its approach. So we now have like a kind of hub and spoke model here that we're negotiating. And so even if we do get deals and we do nothing on the U.S. side, and all of these countries decide they're going to eliminate tariffs on the United States, and they're going to deal with some of these non-tariff barriers. Well, first of all, non-tariff barriers are not a one-time thing to negotiate. It's something you negotiate over time. But setting that aside, if you had these deals, we have bilateral deals that are not connected to one another. So we're not embedding U.S. companies, the U.S. into regional value chains. What we're doing is embedding them, or at least trying to embed them in certain types of bilateral deals. So what happens over time is, the ASEANs are negotiating regionally with a lot of other countries, not just RCEP, but they're negotiating deals. A lot of them are in CPTPP in regional value chains. So you're creating incentives for U.S. companies to move manufacturing out of the United States to inside these free trade areas so that they can benefit from a regional agreement rather than a bilateral agreement. Because most of what we produce is not something that is just produced bilaterally, where you're going to need inputs from the region, and you're going to want to be part of an agreement that not only accepts that there are regional value chains, but tries to build and strengthen them.
I like the way you set that up, because a lot of people conflate deals and agreements. And actually, if you watch the tape of this after we get off and end the event, you'll see that you parse that by using the word deals in relationship to the U.S. and agreements in relation to what was being done among the ASEAN themselves. And I think that's an incredibly important point that is lost in a lot of the discussion. Essentially, what the administration is doing is deals, and the U.S. is not doing agreements anymore. And that really teases a question to how much do countries in the region want agreements and not deals? And essentially what the U.S. is offering to provide are deals. Deals can be incredibly diverse. Deals are essentially at the border. Deals don't really affect long-term competition policy. Deals, as I said earlier, they're not really principled. And then deals undermine regional cohesion, whereas agreements do the opposite. And so I'm just wondering, so we're in a world of deals with the US, but in a world of agreements, potentially with the Europeans, maybe even with the Indians, although that's a different setup. China there's a China agreement, although it's a China-like agreement. RCEP is an agreement. From a Southeast Asian perspective, what does it mean to have a United States that doesn't do agreements anymore, plurilaterally?
Wait, are you asking me? Or are you asking
Gita?
Okay.
Sorry, what was the question, Evan?
The Southeast Asians want the U.S. back in the room for agreements as opposed to just making deals. It really gets at a question. There's a question from the audience here about, if I may be polite, I guess the phrase I would use is rent-seeking behavior. So essentially, the way the question from the audience member is set up is, well, the Qataris gave the president a plane, so why don't the Southeast Asians basically give him this or give him that? And the Vietnamese, I think, are clearing a golf course through a regulatory process very quickly. So that's an example of like it's just deal making. And I guess what I'm asking you is, would Southeast Asians prefer to have the U.S. back in doing agreements? It could be plurilateral. It could even be bilaterals, but something that looks more like an old style agreement. Barbara was doing FTAs, as she said.
We're not against it, Evan, and Barbara knew this. I was being accosted with the TPP frame back in 2011, Honolulu. The only problem with that is the Americans are so good in intellectualizing the frame. keep in mind that, we're still a developing country. Many of us in Southeast Asia, back then in 2011, we didn't understand intellectual property rights. We didn't understand, human rights the way you wanted us to understand it. We didn't understand government procurement. And if you contrast that with the framing of RCEP, which I initiated in 2011, RCEP is 18th century. TPP was 22nd century. And geopolitically, socially, culturally, economically, it's a lot easier to roll forward as opposed to trying to roll something backward, because you run the risk of, stumbling. And the problem at that time for me was, how do I sell this thing to the people? Because most of my people and constituents probably don't have any comprehension of some of the stuff that's in there. So yes, we'd be happy to entertain or enter into an agreement discussion with the Americans, but as long as it doesn't get overly intellectualized, and that's how things get done. And I say this with full cognizance of the fact that the Singaporeans are a completely different planet. They can intellectualize frames, the way the Americans do, but most of us in Southeast Asia don't have that capability.
What's the state of American credibility in Southeast Asia? I mean, if I think about it historically, the U.S. has faced several crises of confidence in this part of the world over the last few decades, right? So in 1975, the U.S. essentially loses the Vietnam War and faces a sort of a security crisis of confidence, because a lot of countries wondered if the U.S. would even stay in the region or just would pick up and go. And the United States got over that hump strategically. Right, then you come to 1997, 98, the US bails out Mexico in 94, refuses to bail out Thailand in 97. People are still talking about that today. There's a little bit of a crisis of confidence there. Is the US facing a kind of crisis of confidence now, that it is either disinterested in the region or not taking the region's concerns to heart, is overly self-interested? What has the US taken a credibility hit from any of this?
No, I mean,
not really.
I mean, I can't speak for all, but I can speak for many. We recognize that whatever we're going through with respect to the U.S. is episodic. And I must emphasize that, many of us in Southeast Asia recognize China and the U.S. as indispensable inevitabilities for the next 50 to 100 years. We've got to deal with you guys. And I see you as an economic capital allocator, to some extent technological capital allocator, but it's just too darn expensive. It's just got to wait until we get everybody up the needle, in terms of getting their GDP up to $30,000 to $40,000, but that's going to take 20 to 30 years. So I think it's episodic. I don't think there's a secular credibility crisis.
Okay. Could I ask you about Indonesia specifically? I mean, Prabowo is relatively new in office and has aspired to, can you just say something about Indonesia's growth and strategic trajectory and how the U.S. fits into that, and how Prabowo might to shape that?
Prabowo is an internationalist. Okay, he grew up in Europe. He speaks Dutch, German, French, and English, and Bahasa. He is instinctively an internationalist. He wants to embrace and be embraced by the international community. So that speaks of his, inclination to be friends with everybody, including the Americans, including the Chinese, including the Europeans. So that's structural. Second, he is aspirational in terms of trying to get the economic growth trajectory to 8% per year. And the only way to do that, I mean, it's on the baseline of 5%. We're talking about a delta of 3%. 3% in the context of $1.5 trillion worth of GDP is only $45 billion worth of additional FDI. Southeast Asia gets about 200 to 230 billion dollars worth of FDI, of which Singapore gets 100 to 140 billion dollars. Indonesia has been getting about 30 billion dollars. So all he needs to do is just move the needle up from $30 billion to $75 billion worth of FDI. He will achieve the 8% growth. Now, for him to do that, he needs to make sure that the enforceability of rules and regulations is there. He needs to make sure that people have much greater wherewithal to translate uncertainties into risks that can be priced. And I think he is on track. Will he be able to achieve that this year? No. But will he be able to achieve that in the next 2 to 3 years? I think he could.
Okay. Barbara, there's a question from somebody in the audience about skittishness. The way it's framed is skittishness in the U.S. markets. Essentially, U.S. announces a policy, there's a market reaction, and then the U.S. kind of shifts course. So it's about market reaction, but it's really about uncertainty and variability in U.S. policy and how that's being interpreted in Southeast Asia. So Gita can come to that, but you spend a lot of time in the region. You can broaden this beyond Southeast Asia if you want. I'm just wondering, does market uncertainty affect perceptions of the U.S. in the region? But then particularly, does the administration's reactions since early April to market uncertainty affect the way people look at the consistency and stability of U.S. policy? That's for Barbara.
I mean, I think they have been watching what's happened over the last several months. I mean, they are watching the taco phenomena, and they saw. I think it was very evident from announcements both when the UK deal was announced, but also the China deal was announced, and the pause on tariffs. You know, these various points over the last few months that have made abundantly clear that the U.S. was concerned about the economic impact, not necessarily the immediate market impact, although I think that the tariff pause was a result of what people were seeing in the market here, especially the bond market. But, you know, for purposes more generally, I don't think it really affects their perception, nor do I think it actually affects the way they're thinking about negotiations individually. They recognize that one or more countries are likely to come to a deal with the United States. So for each country that reaches some kind of deal, then it's fewer countries left, so that if the U.S. imposed tariffs, you know, reimpose the higher tariffs after July 8th, it will have less of an impact on the market because there's fewer countries left. And so they're sort of betting how will this affect them. And I think that's more the immediate concern than anything kind of longer term about their, you know, about their sense of the U.S. or the U.S. credibility. You know, this is all a big negotiation, and they understand that.
I'm watching the clock here. We only have about 3 minutes. So for Barbara, if you were back in government, I mean, let's put aside the kind of oddness of the process and the way the president makes decisions. What would be your top 3 prescriptions for how the U.S. can either leverage the current moment to advantage for U.S. competitiveness in the region, for better deal making, or for strategic ends? Like, it kind of, what would be your top 3 prescriptions if you were writing a decision memo up to the president on how to manage the trade space in the region?
Well, I think number one would be to think about this as a win-win opportunity, you know, and to stop thinking about this as a grievance exercise, and to think about it as, we have a region that's very important to us economically. What can we do to negotiate something that provides a win-win outcome and that promotes, you know, ASEAN as a region, which is in our interest? I think that we should be thinking, as you said up front, what are the areas where we have common interests? You know, the ASEANs are looking to promote their digital transformation and participation in a digital world. What can we do on the digital side? And you know, the last administration didn't do much, so now this is an opportunity for them to really stand out and do something meaningful with the ASEAN region. And then I think, going back to, again, critical minerals, this is an area very important to ASEANs and something important to us. We should step up and try to put that front and center.
Okay. And then, Gita, I'm going to flip to you, and you're going to get the last word. So if you're sitting in, you can do this bilaterally, like individual capitals, or you can do this as a region. What are kind of your top 3 ways that Southeast Asians or individual capitals can leverage the moment? Not just vis-a-vis the United States, but vis-a-vis also other external partners. I'm thinking of China, but also some of the others as well. And I know you've gotten to some of this in the conversation. But
Yeah, I think it's
We're back in government. Your trade minister. Kind of what are the
the,
what are your top three?
no. Yeah, let me just state that, as much as there is a perception of a reduction of credibility, as much as there is a perception of increasing uncertainties, skittishness, as you aptly pointed out, the ASEANites, the Southeast Asians, we take the long view. We know we don't have leverage. We know this is episodic. We've got to come to the table and do a deal with you guys on July 8th. That's a given, I think. Beyond that, I think we've got to basically, try to diversify, for the next, short term, possibly midterm, out to different markets. And I think China, the economic realism is such that China is out there, throwing, handouts or opening arms and whatever. So that's I think the kind of stuff that I think the Americans need to realize in terms of what's happening on the ground in Southeast Asia. The last bit would be a restatement of what I said earlier. I think Southeast Asia needs to look at the U.S. much more as an economic capital allocator as opposed to technological capital allocator, given the fact that we're not with the kind of economic wherewithal as some of our friends that are developed. So I think China and the U.S. will remain as indispensable inevitabilities for a long time for Southeast
One on
Asia.
capital, one on technology, and that's not just a
Correct.
question. And attracting more capital for the U.S. That's not just a question on the supply side. You're saying it's an issue on the demand side in terms of what the policy and enabling environment.
Correct.
Okay, good. Well, I love this issue, this set of issues, because it's a short-term story it's in the headlines, and actually is time bound in a sense because there's this July deadline coming up, but with long-term and big implications that are going to play out over a decade or two. So in that context, it's why I was excited to do this. And I don't think the region gets enough attention, particularly in the U.S. conversation. Good news about Carnegie, since you're both non-resident scholars at Carnegie now, is we are an American headquartered institution, but we're a global one. And in fact, we're in Southeast Asia now too. We've just opened an office in of Carnegie centers in Asia that includes New Delhi, and in the past we've operated in Beijing too. So we're in Asia for Asia, and this is increasingly a complex and multidimensional, multifaceted conversation. And so I feel like Carnegie's well positioned for that, but we're better positioned because we have both of you as non-resident scholars. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you doing this. And what that means is you're going to hear a lot from me about wanting you to help enliven what's happening in the region for the audiences for our content. So thanks to you, and thanks to the audience for tuning in. We appreciate it. And go to the website, carnegieendowment.org, and you can read some of the things we're writing on the region. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.